The auctioneer's voice, amplified and crackling, cut through the humid Iowa air. "Going once, going twice, sold, to Mr. Caldwell for $32,000. A collective sigh, heavy with resignation and the scent of sun-baked earth, swept through the assembled crowd. Another farm gone under. Cletus Johnson leaned against the fender of his Farmall M, its faded red paint a testament to decades of honest labor. He watched as Caldwell, a man whose belly strained against the buttons of his crisp, new overalls, swaggered away, a satisfied smirk plastered across his face. Caldwell, with his gleaming fleet of John Deere equipment and his insatiable appetite for land, was becoming a plague on these parts. The widow, Mrs. Henderson, stood ramrod straight beside the dilapidated farmhouse, her face etched with a stoic sadness that mirrored the weathered clapboard behind her. Cletus knew she'd fought tooth and nail to keep the farm, her husband's legacy, but the bank, as it always did, had won. Cletus's own spread, 80 acres nestled in a valley a few miles south, wasn't much to look at. The farmhouse was small, the barn a bit sway-backed, but everything was paid for. He'd inherited the land from his father, who in turn had inherited it from his. Generations of Johnsons had coaxed a living from this stubborn Iowa soil, and Cletus intended to keep it that way. He glanced at his Farmall M again, then at the John Deere 4020 parked nearby, owned by a young buck named Danny. Danny was always talking about horsepower and hydraulics, scoffing at Cletus's antiques. Cletus spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. Let them have their fancy tractors and their mountains of debt. He'd stick with what he knew. The auction continued, a grim procession of farm equipment, household goods, and memories sold off to the highest bidder. Cletus watched as a hand-cranked cream separator, identical to the one his mother had used, went for a pittance. It felt like watching a part of himself being auctioned off as well. He saw Mrs. Henderson walk slowly toward the house, her shoulders slumped. He knew he should say something, offer some words of comfort, but the words wouldn't come. What could he say? Sorry you lost everything? It felt hollow, inadequate. Instead, he climbed onto his Farmall M, the familiar clatter of the engine, a small comfort in the face of so much loss. He eased the tractor out of the field and onto the gravel road, the setting sun casting long shadows across the landscape. As he drove home, Cletus thought about Caldwell. He remembered a conversation they'd had at the feed store a few months back. Caldwell, puffed up with arrogance, had declared that the only way to survive in modern farming was to go big or go home. He'd laughed when Cletus had countered that the only way to truly survive was to stay out of debt. Cletus wondered if Caldwell truly understood the weight of those words. Debt was a chain, slowly but surely binding you to the whims of the bank, the markets, the weather. Freedom, Cletus believed, was owning your land outright, being beholden to no one. Before we go any further in this story of hard work and even harder times, I've got a question for you. What's your take on debt? Is it a necessary evil in modern farming, or a trap waiting to spring? Drop a comment below. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. The next morning, Cletus was up before dawn, the rooster's crow a familiar alarm clock. He walked out to the barn, the air crisp and cool, carrying the scent of hay and manure. He ran a hand over the smooth wood of the barn door, a door his grandfather had built with his own 2 hands. He fired up the Farmall M, the engine coughing and sputtering, before settling into its steady rhythm. He hitched up the disc harrow and headed out to the South 40, the rising sun painting the sky in hues of orange and gold. The soil was dry and hard, the result of a long, hot summer. The Farmall M strained against the resistance, its engine working hard. Cletus adjusted the throttle, feeling the vibrations through the seat of his pants. He knew this tractor, like he knew his own body. He could tell by the sound of the engine, the feel of the steering wheel, whether everything was running smoothly. He worked steadily for hours, the sun climbing higher in the sky, the air growing hotter. He took a break around midday, sitting in the shade of a lone oak tree, drinking water from his canteen. He watched a hawk circling overhead, its sharp eyes scanning the fields below. As he sat there, he thought about Mrs. Henderson again. He wondered what she would do now. Where would she go? He knew she had no family left. The thought gnawed at him. He finished dissing the South 40 in the late afternoon, the Farmall M finally falling silent as he pulled it back into the barn. He unhitched the disc harrow and began to clean the tractor, wiping away the dust and grime with a rag. That evening, after supper, Cletus sat on the porch, watching the fireflies dance in the twilight. He could hear the crickets chirping in the fields, their song a constant reminder of the passing of time. He thought about his father, and his grandfather, and all the generations of Johnsons who had worked this land. He thought about their struggles, their triumphs, their unwavering commitment to the soil. He knew that farming was a hard life, a life of long hours, unpredictable weather, and fluctuating markets. But it was also a life of deep satisfaction, a life of connection to the land, a life of independence. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He would never let go of this land. He would never let the bank take it away. He would work hard, he would save his money, and he would stay out of debt. That was the Johnson way. The next few years were a grind. Cletus continued to farm his 80 acres, stubbornly clinging to his old equipment. He watched as Caldwell and others like him bought up more and more land, fueled by cheap credit and the promise of ever-increasing profits. The early 1970s were a boom time for agriculture. Grain prices soared, driven by increased demand from overseas. Farmers who had invested heavily in new equipment and expanded their operations were making a killing. Caldwell was one of them. He bought a new combine, a John Deere 7700, and a fleet of grain trucks. He hired extra hands to help him with the harvest. He seemed to be everywhere, buying land, selling grain, making deals. Cletus watched it all with a mixture of envy and disdain. He knew that Caldwell was living on borrowed money, that his empire was built on a foundation of debt. He also knew that the boom couldn't last forever. He continued to farm his land the old-fashioned way, using his Farmall M, his Farmall H, and his trusty Ford 8N. He patched and repaired his equipment, keeping it running with ingenuity and elbow grease. He was often ridiculed for his frugality. People called him old-fashioned, stubborn, and behind the times. They said he was missing out on the opportunities of the modern era. But Cletus didn't care. He knew that he was doing what was right for him, what was right for his land, and what was right for his family's legacy. One sweltering afternoon, while baling hay in the back 40, the universal joint on Cletus's old New Holland baler seized up with a horrifying screech. The machine ground to a halt, leaving him stranded in the middle of the field with a mountain of unbaled hay and the sun beating down on his neck. Cletus let out a string of curses that would have made a sailor blush. He knew this baler was on its last legs, but he'd been hoping to squeeze one more season out of it. Now, it looked like he was going to be spending the rest of the day, and probably several more, wrestling with rusty bolts and greasy parts. He walked back to the farmhouse, his boots kicking up dust with every step. He grabbed his toolbox, a collection of wrenches, sockets, and screwdrivers that had been passed down through generations. He also grabbed a can of WD-40, his trusty companion in the battle against rust and corrosion. Back at the baler, Cletus surveyed the damage. The universal joint was completely shot, the bearings ground to dust. He knew he couldn't just replace the joint. He'd have to take the whole baler apart to get to it. He started by disconnecting the PTO shaft, the long metal rod that connected the tractor to the baler. The shaft was heavy and greasy, and Cletus struggled to wrestle it free. Finally, with a grunt of effort, he managed to disconnect it and lay it on the ground. Next, he started removing the belts and pulleys that drove the baler's various mechanisms. The belts were cracked and frayed, and the pulleys were covered in rust. Cletus knew he'd have to replace them all eventually, but for now, he just needed to get them out of the way. As he worked, sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes. The sun beat down relentlessly, turning the field into a furnace. Cletus took frequent breaks, drinking water from his canteen and wiping his brow with a rag. He finally managed to remove the universal joint, revealing the extent of the damage. The bearings were completely gone, and the metal was scored and gouged. It was a mess. Cletus knew he couldn't fix this himself. He'd have to take the universal joint to a machine shop and have it rebuilt. He loaded the part into his pickup truck and drove into town, his body aching from the day's labor. The machine shop was a small, cluttered place, filled with the smell of oil and metal. The owner, a grizzled old man named Earl, greeted Cletus with a nod. Cletus explained the problem, and Earl examined the universal joint with a practiced eye. "This is going to take some work," he said, "but I think I can fix it." Cletus left the universal joint with Earl and drove back to the farm. He knew he wouldn't be able to bale any more hay until he got the part back, but he couldn't afford to sit around and do nothing. He decided to spend the rest of the day fixing a fence that had been damaged by a recent storm. He spent the afternoon hammering posts, stretching wire, and stapling it to the posts. It was hard work, but it was satisfying to see the fence slowly taking shape. As he worked, he thought about the baler. He knew it was old and worn out, but he couldn't afford to replace it. New equipment was expensive, and he refused to go into debt to buy it. He knew that his frugality was often seen as a weakness, but he saw it as a strength. He was determined to stay out of debt, no matter what. He'd seen too many farmers lose their farms because they'd borrowed too much money. He finished the fence, just as the sun was setting. He walked back to the farmhouse, his body tired, but his spirit strong. He knew he could face whatever challenges lay ahead, as long as he stayed true to his principles. A few days later, Cletus received a call from Earl at the machine shop. The universal joint was ready. Cletus drove into town to pick it up, eager to get back to baling hay. Earl handed him the rebuilt universal joint, and Cletus examined it carefully. It looked like new. "You did a good job, Earl," he said. "Just glad I could help," Earl replied. "These old machines are worth saving." Cletus paid Earl and drove back to the farm. He wasted no time installing the universal joint on the baler. He reconnected the PTO shaft, replaced the belts and pulleys, and tightened all the bolts. Finally, he was ready to test it. He fired up the Farmel M and engaged the PTO. The baler sprang to life, its gears whirring and its belts spinning. Cletus watched carefully, listening for any unusual noises. Everything seemed to be working perfectly. He smiled. He'd saved himself a lot of money by fixing the baler himself. He spent the next few days baling hay, working long hours to get the job done. The weather was hot and humid, but he didn't complain. He was grateful to be able to work his land, to provide for himself, and to stay out of debt. As the 1970s wore on, the agricultural boom continued. Land prices soared, and farmers who had invested heavily in new equipment and expanded their operations were becoming wealthy. Caldwell was at the forefront of this trend. He bought more land, built bigger barns, and purchased even more equipment. He seemed to be unstoppable. Cletus watched it all with a growing sense of unease. He knew that the boom couldn't last forever, and he worried about what would happen when the bubble burst. He continued to farm his land the old-fashioned way, stubbornly clinging to his old equipment and his debt-free philosophy. He was often criticized for his conservatism, but he refused to change his ways. He remembered what his father had told him. "Son, always remember that land is the best investment you can make. But never, ever go into debt to buy it." Cletus had taken those words to heart. He knew that land was valuable, but he also knew that debt was a dangerous trap. One evening, while sitting on the porch, watching the sunset, Cletus overheard a conversation between two of his neighbors. They were talking about Caldwell and his latest acquisition, a 1,000-acre farm that had just come on the market. "Caldwell's going to be a millionaire," one of them said. "He's got it all figured out." "Maybe," the other one replied. "But I wouldn't want to be in his shoes when the interest rates go up." Cletus listened intently. He knew that interest rates were starting to rise, and he wondered how Caldwell would be able to handle the increased debt burden. He also wondered if Caldwell had considered the possibility of a drought or a drop in grain prices, or any of the other unforeseen disasters that could befall a farmer. Cletus knew that farming was a risky business, and he believed that the only way to survive was to be prepared for the worst. That meant staying out of debt, saving your money, and taking care of your land. He looked out at his fields, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. He knew that his farm wasn't much to look at, but it was his. He owned it free and clear, and he wouldn't trade it for all the money in the world. He stood up and walked inside, feeling a sense of peace and contentment. He didn't need to be rich. He just needed to be able to make a living, to provide for himself, and to keep his land in the family. As the 1970s drew to a close, the first signs of trouble began to appear. Grain prices started to fall, and interest rates continued to rise. Farmers who had borrowed heavily to expand their operations were starting to feel the pinch. Caldwell was one of them. He had overextended himself, and he was now struggling to make his loan payments. He started selling off some of his equipment to raise cash, but it wasn't enough. Cletus watched with a mixture of concern and satisfaction. He didn't want to see anyone lose their farm, but he also couldn't help feeling that Caldwell was getting what he deserved. One day, Cletus received a visit from a banker. The banker was a young man, dressed in a suit and tie. He introduced himself as Mr. Thompson, and he said he wanted to talk to Cletus about his finances. Cletus invited Mr. Thompson into his farmhouse, and they sat down at the kitchen table. Mr. Thompson pulled out a file and started asking Cletus about his income, his expenses, and his assets. Cletus answered his questions truthfully, but he could tell that Mr. Thompson was skeptical. Mr. Thompson seemed to think that Cletus was foolish for not borrowing more money and expanding his operations. "Mr. Johnson," Mr. Thompson said, "you're missing out on a great opportunity. You could be making a lot more money if you would just borrow some money and invest in new equipment." "I appreciate your advice, Mr. Thompson," Cletus replied, "but I'm happy with the way things are. I don't need to be rich. I just need to be able to make a living." Mr. Thompson shook his head. "I don't understand you farmers," he said. "You're so stubborn. You refuse to change with the times." "Maybe so," Cletus said, "but I've seen too many farmers lose their farms because they borrowed too much money. I'm not going to make that mistake." Mr. Thompson closed his file and stood up. "Well, Mr. Johnson," he said, "I wish you the best of luck, but I think you're going to regret your decision." Cletus watched Mr. Thompson leave, feeling a sense of foreboding. He knew that the times were changing, and he wasn't sure if he could survive. Act 4. The Turning Point. The summer of 1980 arrived like a furnace blast. Day after day, the sun beat down on Iowa, baking the soil to a cracked, lifeless crust. The corn stalks, usually a vibrant green, withered and turned brown, their leaves rustling like dry paper in the relentless wind. The soybeans, normally lush and full, remained stunted and meager. Cletus watched the drought unfold with a growing sense of dread. He knew that without rain, his crops were doomed. He prayed for a break in the weather, but the skies remained stubbornly clear. He wasn't the only one suffering. Farmers all across the Midwest were facing the same crisis. The price of grain soared as supplies dwindled, but the higher prices did little good for those who had nothing to sell. Caldwell, despite his modern irrigation system, was also feeling the heat. His wells were running low, and his pumps were straining to keep up with the demand. He was forced to ration water, and his crops were still suffering. One afternoon, while Cletus was checking his well, he noticed that the pressure was low. He knew that his well was old and shallow, and he worried that it might run dry. He decided to conserve water as much as possible, watering his garden sparingly and letting his livestock drink from the creek. That evening, as he sat on the porch, he heard a loud bang coming from Caldwell's farm. He walked over to investigate and found Caldwell standing beside his irrigation pump, his face red with anger. "Damn thing blew a gasket," Caldwell shouted. "Can't get parts for it anywhere. This Italian-made POS is going to ruin me." Cletus examined the pump. It was a complicated piece of machinery, with a maze of pipes and valves. He'd never seen anything like it before. "Looks like a mess," Cletus said. "A mess is an understatement," Caldwell replied. "This whole operation is a mess. I'm up to my eyeballs in debt, and now this happens. I'm ruined, I tell you. Ruined." Cletus didn't say anything. He knew that Caldwell was in trouble, but he couldn't bring himself to feel sorry for him. Caldwell had brought this on himself, with his reckless borrowing and his insatiable greed. "You know, Cletus," Caldwell said, his voice softening, "maybe you were right all along. Maybe it's better to be debt-free, even if it means you don't have all the fancy equipment." Cletus nodded. "Maybe so, Earl. Maybe so." The drought continued for weeks, and the situation grew increasingly desperate. Farmers started selling off their livestock, unable to afford the high price of feed. Banks began foreclosing on farms, and the auctioneer's voice became a constant presence in the countryside. Cletus managed to scrape by, thanks to his frugality and his debt-free status. He harvested what little he could from his fields, and he sold some of his livestock to pay his taxes. He knew he was lucky to be surviving, but he worried about the future. One evening, while listening to the radio, he heard a report about a new government program that was designed to help farmers. The program offered low-interest loans and other forms of assistance. Cletus was tempted to apply for a loan, but he resisted the urge. He knew that debt was a dangerous trap, and he didn't want to risk losing his farm. He decided to stick with what he knew, to work hard, to save his money, and to hope for the best. Act 5. The crisis. The fall of 1980 brought no relief. The drought continued and the economy worsened. Interest rates soared to record levels, making it even harder for farmers to make their loan payments. Caldwell's situation deteriorated rapidly. He was forced to sell off more of his equipment, and he laid off his hired hands. He became increasingly desperate, and he started making rash decisions. One day, Cletus heard that Caldwell had been arrested for writing bad checks. He was shocked by the news, but he wasn't surprised. He knew that Caldwell was under a lot of pressure, and he suspected that he had been cutting corners to stay afloat. With Caldwell in jail and his farm in receivership, the bank moved quickly to seize his assets. An auction was scheduled for the following week. Cletus attended the auction, along with hundreds of other farmers and townspeople. The atmosphere was grim. Everyone knew that Caldwell's downfall was a sign of the times. The auctioneer's voice, amplified and crackling, echoed across the farmyard. "Going once, Going twice. Sold. To the bank. For $1. The crowd gasped. It was a symbolic gesture, a way for the bank to take possession of Caldwell's assets without having to pay anything for them. The auction continued, a grim procession of farm equipment, household goods, and memories sold off to the highest bidder. Cletus watched as Caldwell's John Deere 7700 combine, his pride and joy, went for a fraction of its original price. He saw Caldwell's wife, Martha, standing beside the farmhouse, her face etched with sadness. He knew she was devastated by what had happened. Cletus felt a pang of sympathy for her. He knew that she had been against Caldwell's reckless borrowing, but she had been powerless to stop him. After the auction, Cletus approached Martha. "I'm sorry for your loss, Martha," he said. Martha looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, Cletus," she said. "Earl was a fool. He got greedy, and he ruined us all." Cletus nodded. "Sometimes it's better to be content with what you have," he said. Martha sighed. "I wish Earl had listened to you," she said. "Maybe things would have been different." Cletus didn't say anything. He knew that there was nothing he could say to make things better. He walked back to his pickup truck, feeling a sense of relief and gratitude. He had survived the crisis thanks to his frugality and his debt-free status. He knew that he was lucky, and he vowed to never forget the lessons he had learned. As the 1980s progressed, the agricultural crisis deepened. More and more farms went under, and rural communities were devastated. The American heartland was in a state of despair. Cletus continued to farm his land, stubbornly clinging to his old equipment and his debt-free philosophy. He watched as his neighbors struggled to survive, and he did what he could to help them. He offered them advice, he loaned them equipment, and he gave them food. He knew that they were all in this together, and he believed that they had to support each other. One day, while working in his fields, Cletus noticed a young man walking down the road. The young man was carrying a backpack, and he looked tired and hungry. Cletus stopped his tractor and offered the young man a ride. The young man introduced himself as David, and he said he was a college student who was traveling across the country looking for work. Cletus offered David a job on his farm. David accepted, and he quickly proved to be a hard worker. He helped Cletus with the harvest, he repaired fences, and he did whatever else needed to be done. Cletus enjoyed having David around. He liked his enthusiasm and his willingness to learn. He also appreciated his company. One evening, while sitting on the porch, Cletus asked David about his plans for the future. David said he wanted to be a farmer, but he didn't have any money to buy land. Cletus thought for a moment. Then he said, "David, I'm getting old. I don't have any children. Maybe, just maybe, you could take over this farm someday." David was stunned. "Mr. Johnson," he said, "I don't know what to say. That's the nicest thing anyone has ever said to me." Cletus smiled. "Well, David," he said, "you've earned it. You're a good worker, and you're a good person. I think you'd make a fine farmer." Act 6. Vindication and Legacy. The mid-1980s brought a gradual, grudging recovery to the American heartland. Interest rates eased, grain prices stabilized, and the land slowly began to heal. But the scars of the crisis remained, etched on the faces of those who had survived. Cletus continued to mentor David, teaching him the skills and knowledge he would need to run the farm. David proved to be a quick learner, and he soon became proficient in all aspects of farming. One day, Cletus received a letter from the bank. The bank was offering to sell Caldwell's old farm at a reduced price. Cletus considered the offer carefully. He knew that the farm was in bad shape, but he also knew that it was a good piece of land. He decided to make an offer. The bank accepted his offer, and Cletus became the owner of Caldwell's old farm. He hired David to help him fix it up, and together They worked tirelessly to restore it to its former glory. They repaired the barns, they rebuilt the fences, and they planted new crops. Slowly but surely, the farm began to come back to life. One evening, while sitting on the porch of the old Caldwell farmhouse, Cletus and David watched the sunset. The sky was ablaze with color, and the air was filled with the scent of freshly cut hay. "This is beautiful, Mr. Johnson," David said. "I can't believe we did this." Cletus smiled. "We did it together, David," he said. "And we did it without going into debt." David nodded. "That's right," he said. "We learned our lesson." Cletus looked out at the fields, feeling a sense of pride and accomplishment. He had survived the crisis, he had helped his neighbors, and he had passed on his legacy to a new generation. A few years later, Martha Caldwell came to visit Cletus. She had remarried and moved to a nearby town. "Cletus," she said, "I wanted to thank you for what you did for Earl. He was a stubborn man, but he wasn't a bad man. He just got caught up in things." Cletus nodded. "I know, Martha," he said. "We all make mistakes." Martha smiled. "You were always a good friend, Cletus," she said. "I'm glad you're still around." Cletus smiled back. "I'm glad you're doing well, Martha," he said. As the years passed, Cletus grew old and frail. He eventually turned the farm over to David, who continued to run it with the same frugality and dedication that Cletus had instilled in him. Cletus lived out his remaining years in the farmhouse, watching David work the land. He died peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by his friends and neighbors. His funeral was a large and well-attended event. People came from all over the county to pay their respects to a man who had been a pillar of the community. David delivered the eulogy. "Cletus Johnson was a good man," he said. "He was a hard worker, he was a generous neighbor, and he was a true friend. He taught me everything I know about farming, and he taught me the importance of staying out of debt. I will never forget him." After the funeral, the community gathered at the local church for a potluck dinner. People shared stories about Cletus, and they laughed and cried together. One of the people who attended the dinner was an old farmer named Earl. Earl had been one of Cletus's closest friends, and he had always admired his frugality and his debt-free philosophy. "Cletus was a wise man," Earl said. "He knew that the only way to survive in farming was to stay out of debt. He was right, and we were wrong." The other farmers nodded in agreement. They had all learned a valuable lesson from Cletus Johnson. From that day forward, the community began to embrace Cletus's philosophy. They started saving their money, they started paying off their debts, and they started taking care of their land. The American heartland slowly began to recover, and the scars of the crisis began to fade. The legacy of Cletus Johnson lived on, inspiring generations of farmers to come. Years later, David, now an old man himself, sat on the porch of the farmhouse, watching his own grandson work the land. He smiled, knowing that the Johnson legacy would continue for generations to come. The wisdom of staying out of debt, of respecting the land, and of helping one's neighbor had been passed down, unbroken. And the widow Henderson's farm, now part of the larger Johnson spread, was a testament to the enduring power of resilience and the importance of community in the face of adversity. The sun set on the Iowa landscape, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold, a promise of a new day and a new generation to carry on the traditions of the heartland.